Hey there. Tonight, we're entering the sun-scorched dust of ancient Egypt. We are not entering as a pharaoh, not even as a priest, but as a slave who learns the hard way that asking for water can get you killed. Drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing this little time-traveling community pop up from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's drift far, far away. The corpse of the slave who died yesterday is still being dragged past your sleeping quarters when the wooden rod cracks against the wall. You jolt awake to the sound of dead weight scraping across stone and the overseer's voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Up, you worthless dogs, the sun waits for no slave. This is how every day begins in paradise, with a reminder that you're one stumble away from becoming tomorrow's morning entertainment. The body bouncing past your reed mat belongs to someone who was pulling rope alongside you just 12 hours ago, before he made the fatal mistake of asking for water during the afternoon shift. Now he's decorating the pathway to the work site. His tunic is torn and stained with substances you don't want to identify. You roll off your sleeping mat with the grace of a sack of grain hitting the ground. Your back screams in protest. 20 other bodies shuffle around you in quarters barely large enough for a nobleman's chariot. Each movement is accompanied by the symphony of joints popping like kindling in a fire. The man next to you coughs up what sounds like limestone dust mixed with blood. He's been making that sound for weeks now, and you all know where that particular melody leads. The overseer stands in the doorway. His whip is coiled at his side like a pet snake waiting for breakfast. His own scars mark him as former property. But now he gets to play master in this theatre of human misery. You recognize the look in his eyes as he counts you like livestock. He's checking his inventory before another day of systematic destruction begins. 20 slaves went to sleep last night. 19 are getting up this morning. The math of slavery is always subtractive. The pharaoh's tomb won't build itself. He barks. And you suppress the urge to point out that it practically could, given how many of you die constructing it. But humor gets you dragged away by guards. And you've seen enough entertainment for one morning. The wise move is to keep your mouth shut and shuffle toward another day of pretending you're not human. Outside, the courtyard fills with work gangs organizing themselves into human machinery. Stone cutters gather around tools that will slice their hands as often as they cut rock. Haulers, your particular circle of hell, form up in lines that will spend the day proving that people can indeed be used as substitute oxen. Brickmakers prepare for another session of discovering creative ways clay dust can destroy human lungs. The limestone dust from yesterday's work has settled into every pore of your skin. It mixes with sweat to create a paste that makes you feel like walking pottery. Your tunic, the same one you sleep in, work in, and will probably die in, clings to your body with the persistence of a second skin you can never shed. When did you last change clothes? The concept seems as foreign as owning property or choosing your own meals. The morning air carries the scent of bread from the free quarters, a smell that hits you like a physical blow. Somewhere beyond these walls, actual human beings are sitting down to meals that include luxuries like meat, fruit, and bread that isn't mostly sand. They're probably complaining about the temperature of their beer while you contemplate whether today's gruel will have more chaff or more hope mixed into it. You flex your hands, already anticipating the rope burns and stone cuts that await. Your palms are a roadmap of old injuries, calluses built on calluses, scars that never fully healed before. New ones appeared. These hands used to belong to someone with a name, a family, maybe even dreams. Now they're just tools that happen to be attached to your arms. And tools that break, get thrown away. The Nile glimmers in the distance like a promise of coolness you'll never reach. Its waters flow past this monument to human misery, carrying boats full of nobles who travel between their estates while you move blocks of stone that weigh more than their entire households. The river that gives life to Egypt might as well be on another planet for all the good it does you. Other slaves emerge from their quarters like ghosts materializing at dawn. Each face tells the same story. Exhaustion worn into permanent features. Hope beaten out of eyes that once held dreams. You recognize the look because you see it in every reflective surface. The expression of someone who's forgotten what it feels like to be human. The overseer's patience, never abundant, finally runs out. His whip uncoils like a snake preparing to strike, and the sound of leather slapping against his palm echoes through the courtyard. The guards have finished dragging away last night's casualty, leaving behind only dark stains on the stone that will bake dry under today's sun. Around you, other slaves perform their morning rituals, stretching muscles that have forgotten what rest feels like, checking tools that serve as instruments of their own destruction, mentally preparing for another day of being treated like equipment with legs. The new arrivals still have fat on their bones and rebellion in their eyes. The veterans move with economical precision, conserving every ounce of energy for the marathon of misery ahead. Then there are the walking dead. Slaves who've been here so long, they've forgotten they were ever anything else. Their bodies move through the motions, while their minds retreat to safer places, somewhere far from the sound of whips and the weight of impossible stones. The pre-dawn sky fades from deep blue to pale gold, marking another countdown to collapse. You've learned to read time by the color of the sky, the angle of shadows, the pitch of overseers' voices as they grow more impatient. These are the skills slavery teaches: how to survive by reading the mood of your oppressors, how to gauge exactly how much strength you need to hold in reserve to make it through the day. The wooden rod taps impatiently against stone. Time to transform from person to beast of burden. Time to spend another day building monuments to people who'll never know your name, while slowly erasing yourself from existence. The sun hasn't even cleared the horizon, and you're already tired, not the sleepy tired that comes from a short night, but the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from knowing tomorrow will be exactly the same. Welcome to paradise. Population, everyone but you. The food line forms over the dried bloodstain where they dragged away last night's casualty, and nobody mentions the irony. You shuffle forward with the rest of the human cattle, stepping carefully around the dark patches on the stone that mark where someone's morning routine ended permanently. The guards didn't bother cleaning up. Why waste water on stains when there are living slaves who need that liquid more? The cook stands behind his massive clay pot, like a priest presiding over a ritual sacrifice. Except the only thing being sacrificed is your hope of ever eating real food again. Steam rises from whatever nightmare bubbles inside that vest, carrying a smell that makes your empty stomach clench in anticipation and dread. This man has been ladling punishment into bowls for so long that he's forgotten food is supposed to nourish rather than merely postpone death. You reach the front of the line, and he doesn't look at your face. Why would he? You're just another mouth that needs filling, another body that requires barely enough fuel to swing a hammer or pull a rope before it collapses. The ladle descends into the murky depths and emerges with what can only be described as liquid disappointment, thick enough to hold a spoon upright, thin enough to remind you that this isn't actually food. The bowl they shove into your hands tells its own story of institutional brutality. Wood, cracked from years of abuse, stained with the accumulated misery of 1,000 previous meals, rough enough to give you splinters if you grip it wrong. The contents slosh with the consistency of mud after a flood, and you can already taste the grit that passes for seasoning in this establishment. Barley forms the base. If you can call grain that's been boiled into submission until it surrenders all texture and dignity a base. Mixed in are chunks of what might have been vegetables in a previous life, now reduced to brown lumps that could be anything from turnip to tree bark. The cooking water tastes like it was drawn from a well that's seen better centuries, with a metallic undertone that suggests the pot has been seasoned with rust and despair. Around you, other slaves perform the same grim ritual. Some gulp it down like medicine, trying to get the torture over with as quickly as possible. Others eat slowly, either because swallowing requires more effort than they can muster, or because they're trying to extract every possible calorie from this watery paste. The smart ones, the veterans who've learned to prioritize survival over dignity, clean their bowls completely, understanding that this slop might be the only thing standing between them and collapse before noon. You take your first spoonful, and the taste confirms your lowest expectations. It's like eating disappointment with a side of grit, seasoned with the tears of whoever was forced to cook this atrocity. The barley has been boiled so long it's achieved a texture somewhere between paste and punishment, sticking to your teeth with malicious persistence. The mystery vegetables add bulk without flavor. Having been cooked so thoroughly they've transcended their original identity and become generic brown matter. But the real torture isn't the food itself. It's the contrast playing out 30 yards away. The free workers, men who chose to labor on pharaonic projects for actual wages, sit in the shade, eating from plates that haven't been chipped by decades of abuse, fresh bread, still warm from ovens that understand the difference between baking and burning, dates and figs that remember what sweetness tastes like. Some even get beer with their meals, the good stuff that's been properly fermented, not the watery disappointment that occasionally appears in your evening rations. These free laborers talk while they eat, laugh at jokes, complain about the quality of their food without realizing their worst meal would be your best day. They finish eating and wipe their hands on actual cloth, while you'll be lucky if you can find a clean spot on your tunic to scrape the gruel residue from your fingers. The distance between their breakfast and yours might as well be the width of the kingdom. Two different species eating two different substances in two different worlds. The memory of real food haunts every spoonful, somewhere buried under layers of survival instinct and deliberate forgetfulness. You remember what bread used to taste like when it had crust and crumb instead of just texture, meat that came from identifiable animals rather than the mystery protein that occasionally floats in evening stew. Fruits that burst with sweetness instead of the woody disappointment of dates stored too long in Egyptian heat. You remember eating for pleasure, instead of mere survival, choosing what to consume instead of gratefully accepting whatever keeps you upright. The concept of seasoning salt, herbs, spices that made food worth anticipating feels like mythology now. Your taste buds remember complexity, variety, the simple joy of flavors that complemented each other, instead of competing to see which could disappoint you most thoroughly. The bowl empties faster than you'd like, not because the food is enjoyable, but because once it's gone, the next meal is many hours away. You scrape the wooden sides with your spoon, collecting every last bit of the paste, not from hunger, but from the hard-learned knowledge that waste is a luxury reserved for people whose lives have value. Every calorie, no matter how grudgingly delivered, might be the difference between making it through today and joining tomorrow's morning entertainment. Your stomach feels heavy, but not satisfied, full, but not nourished. The gruel sits in your belly like a stone, providing bulk without comfort, substance without satisfaction. It's fuel, nothing more. Enough to keep your muscles contracting, your brain alert enough to follow orders, your heart beating long enough to be useful to someone else's dreams of immortality. The cook is already serving the next slave before you've stepped away from the pot. No acknowledgement that you're anything more than a biological machine requiring fuel. No recognition that the transaction just completed involved a human being receiving sustenance. You join the flow of slaves moving away from the feeding station, each carrying their empty bowls and the hollow knowledge that this culinary punishment will repeat itself tomorrow, and the day after that, until either your body gives up or someone decides you've outlived your usefulness. The morning sun climbs higher, promising heat that will make you grateful for any liquid, no matter how unappetizing. By midday, you'll remember this gruel fondly, not because it tasted good, but because it was wet and your throat wasn't yet done. Perspective becomes everything when your existence has been reduced to the basic mathematics of survival. Time to pretend you're not starving for another day. Time to discover how much punishment the human body can absorb while running on disappointment and false hope. The rope they loop around your chest weighs more than the chains that brought you here. But at least chains had the honesty to look like bondage. This hemp cord, thick as a man's thumb and rough enough to sand wood, gets dressed up with the word harness, as if calling it something technical makes the reality less degrading. You're about to spend the next 10 hours proving that humans can indeed substitute for ox, and the Egyptian construction industry has refined this substitution to an art form. The limestone block waiting for your attention weighs roughly 3,000 pounds, about the same as 15 full-grown men, which is coincidentally close to the number of slaves it takes to move the damn thing. The stone sits there like a sleeping giant, its surface is marked with chisel scars from the quarry, and dark stains that might be blood from previous hauling attempts. Some optimistic engineer has calculated that 20 slaves can drag this monument to futility across a quarter-mile of sand, up a ramp, and into position without anyone dying. The math seems flawed, but nobody asked for your opinion. The harness arrangement is a masterpiece of human engineering, designed by people who've never worn one. Heavy rope loops around your torso, connecting you to the 19 other members of your biological towing service. The weight distribution ensures that every step will remind you exactly where the rope sits against your ribs, your shoulders, your spine. By noon, these contact points will have rubbed raw. By evening, they'll be bleeding. By tomorrow, they'll have developed the calluses that mark you as professional human livestock. The slave in front of you has been doing this longer. You can tell by the permanent grooves the rope has worn into his shoulders, like geological features carved by years of friction. His back muscles move with the mechanical precision of someone who's learned to convert food into forward motion with maximum efficiency. Behind you, someone's breathing already sounds laboured, and the real work hasn't even started yet. The overseer with the whip takes his position like a chariot driver preparing for a race, except his horses are bipedal, and his track is sand that will fight every step. His voice carries the authority of someone who's discovered that fear works better than encouragement when motivating human machinery. On my count, you worthless animals. 1, 2, pull. The rope goes taut with a snap that travels through the line like lightning through metal, and suddenly you're discovering muscles you forgot you had. The limestone block, which seemed merely heavy while sitting still, reveals its true malevolent nature the moment it starts moving. It doesn't just resist, it actively fights every inch of progress, grinding against the wooden rollers beneath it with sounds like the earth complaining. Your feet slip in the sand as you lean into the harness, feeling the rope cut into your chest with the enthusiasm of a blade. The slave next to you grunts with effort, his face already turning red from exertion that will continue for hours. Someone down the line stumbles, and the entire human machine jerks as 20 bodies try to compensate for one person's momentary failure. The overseer's whip cracks once, not hitting anyone yet, but establishing the consequences of insufficient motivation. Step by grinding step, the block moves forward. The sand beneath your feet offers no traction and no mercy, sliding away just when you need it most. Your lungs start working harder as your body realizes this isn't a sprint, but a marathon of suffering. And oxygen becomes a precious commodity that needs rationing. The morning sun, still climbing toward its daily appointment with cruelty, already promises heat that will turn this labor into a contest between your body's ability to function and the desert's determination to kill everything that moves. The wooden rollers beneath the stone groan with each rotation, occasionally splitting under the weight and requiring replacement by slaves who break from the hauling line to perform emergency maintenance. These interruptions might seem like rest breaks, but standing still while wearing a harness that's cutting into your flesh somehow feels worse than moving. At least when you're pulling, the pain has purpose. The ramp ahead rises at an angle that seemed reasonable when viewed from a distance, but reveals itself as nearly vertical now that you're approaching it. Engineering has determined that human slaves can drag 3,000 pounds up a 15-degree incline without mechanical assistance. The engineers, notably, are not wearing harnesses today. They stand in the shade with their calculation tablets, occasionally making notes about efficiency and timing, while the biological machines they've designed demonstrate the practical applications of their theories. Halfway to the ramp, someone in the middle of the line collapses. The rope jerks. The block stops, and 20 slaves suddenly find themselves holding the full weight of Egyptian limestone, while their teammate receives percussive maintenance from the overseer's encouragement stick. The fallen slave struggles back to his feet, blood trickling from where the wooden rod made contact with his skull, and the human machine resumes its grinding progress toward architectural immortality. Your hands, gripping the rope ahead of you for stability, already show the characteristic rope burns that mark your new profession. The hemp fibers work their way into your palms like tiny spears, each one a reminder that your body is now a construction tool. Your shoulders scream as the harness redistributes the stone's weight across muscles that were designed for more dignified purposes, and your spine compresses with each step like you're being slowly crushed by invisible hands. The contrast between your situation and that of the actual oxen working nearby isn't lost on you. The animals get fed properly, watered regularly, and rested when they show signs of fatigue. When an ox collapses, they bring veterinary care. When a slave collapses, they bring a replacement. The economic calculation is simple. Oxen cost money to replace. Slaves just cost effort. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of your new career isn't the physical punishment, it's the precision with which the work is organized. Someone has calculated exactly how much suffering can be extracted from a human body before it becomes counterproductive. Someone has determined the optimal ratio of nutrition to labor output. Someone has engineered a system that keeps you alive long enough to be useful while ensuring you never recover enough to be dangerous. The limestone block continues its reluctant journey toward immortality, carried by a biological machine that will be forgotten long before the monument is completed. Your feet find new ways to slip in the sand, your lungs find new depths of desperation, and your shoulders discover pain receptors you didn't know existed. This is your career now, professional beast of burden, human ox, biological replacement for proper machinery. Welcome to the construction industry. Try not to die on company time. The first crack of leather against flesh comes without warning, landing across the back of the slave 2 positions ahead of you, with a sound like breaking pottery. He stumbles, but doesn't fall. Falling would mean worse things than the red welt already blooming across his shoulders. The foreman's voice follows the whip strike with the casual tone of someone commenting on the weather. Faster, you lazy dog. The Pharaoh's eternity won't wait for your weakness. This is your introduction to workplace management, Egyptian style. No performance reviews, no motivational speeches, no team-building exercises, just the immediate application of pain to encourage productivity. The foreman, a man whose own scarred back tells the story of his rise through the ranks of human suffering, wields his whip with the precision of a craftsman who spent years perfecting his technique. Every strike is calculated, measured, designed to inflict maximum motivation with minimum permanent damage to valuable property. The leather cord in his hands isn't just a tool. It's a language that speaks in welts and screams, conveying complex messages about performance expectations, workplace standards, and the consequences of failing to meet quotas. You're getting a crash course in this vocabulary as the morning progresses, learning to read the subtle differences between a warning crack in the air above your head and the promise of contact that follows hesitation. The slave who received the morning's first lesson learned it well. His pace increases immediately. His grip on the rope tightens, and his body language shifts from mere exhaustion to the kind of desperate energy that comes from knowing the alternative to speed is agony. The rest of the hauling line absorbs this lesson without needing personal demonstration. The foreman's educational methods have a way of teaching entire groups through individual examples. But efficiency isn't the only subject being taught here. The whip also instructs in hierarchy, reminding every slave exactly where they stand in the social structure of ancient Egypt. Below the pharaoh, below the nobles, below the priests, below the scribes, below the free workers, below the animals. Somewhere in the basement of human dignity, you'll find the slaves, and below them the slaves who've recently disappointed their supervisors. The foreman moves through the worksite like a shark patrolling reef waters, his presence felt even when he's not visible. You can track his location by the subtle changes in posture among the work gangs. Backs straightening, grips tightening, the universal body language of prey animals sensing a predator. His footsteps in the sand sound different from those of ordinary humans, carrying the weight of absolute authority over life and death. When he speaks, it's not to communicate, but to dominate. His words aren't requests or instructions, they're commands backed by the implicit threat of leather meeting flesh. Move that stone faster doesn't mean he'd like you to increase your pace. It means increase your pace, or discover new nerve endings you didn't know could transmit pain. Pull harder isn't encouragement. It's a physics lesson about the relationship between effort and consequences. The whip itself is a work of art in its own brutal way, crafted by artisans who understand the engineering principles of human motivation. The handle fits perfectly in a hand that spent years gripping it, worn smooth by countless applications. The leather cord tapers from thick to thin with mathematical precision, designed to concentrate maximum force at the tip while providing perfect control at the base. Someone put thought into this instrument, calculated its optimal length, tested its flexibility, refined its ability to teach lessons that stick. You watch the foreman demonstrate his teaching technique on a slave who's moving too slowly up the ramp. The first strike lands across the shoulders, a general message about unacceptable performance. The second hits lower, targeting the kidneys with the precision of someone who knows exactly which internal organs respond best to external persuasion. The slave doesn't scream. Screaming is a luxury that attracts more attention, but his pace increases dramatically, and the lesson concludes with improved productivity metrics. The psychological component of the foreman's methodology is perhaps more sophisticated than the physical aspect. He doesn't need to whip every slave to control every slave. The threat alone does most of the work. The knowledge that pain is always one mistake away creates a constant state of anxiety that's almost as effective as actual punishment. Your mind does half the foreman's job for him, constantly calculating risks, measuring your performance against the invisible standards that determine whether leather meets flesh. Between lessons, the foreman surveys his domain with the satisfaction of an artist viewing his masterpiece. Hundreds of slaves moving thousands of pounds of stone with the coordination of a military operation, all motivated by the simple principle that cooperation is less painful than rebellion. He's not just supervising construction, he's conducting a symphony of suffering, and every crack of the whip is another note in his composition. The hierarchy extends beyond just the foreman, though. Assistant overseers patrol their assigned sections, each carrying their own educational tools and their own interpretations of proper motivation. Some prefer the subtle approach, a wooden rod that leaves bruises but no permanent marks. Others favor the direct method, iron-tipped prods that teach lessons in scar tissue. The variety keeps everyone guessing, never quite sure which teaching style they'll encounter next. What makes the system particularly effective is its unpredictability. A slave who's performed adequately for weeks might suddenly find himself receiving instruction for no apparent reason, simply because the foreman decided that fear was becoming too comfortable. Random punishment keeps everyone alert, ensures that good behavior today doesn't guarantee safety tomorrow, maintains the constant state of anxiety that makes rebellion seem impossible. The economic logic underlying this educational system is brutally simple. Fear costs nothing, produces immediate results, and requires no infrastructure beyond leather and human cruelty. No complicated reward systems, no performance incentives, no career advancement opportunities, just the promise that inadequate performance will be met with immediate correction. It's management theory reduced to its most primitive elements, and disturbingly, it works. As the morning progresses and the sun climbs higher, the foreman's lessons become more frequent. Heat makes everyone slower, fatigue makes everyone clumsy, and dehydration makes everyone stupid. All conditions that require additional instruction. The whip speaks its language of motivation more often, its vocabulary expanding to include lessons about endurance, persistence, and the important distinction between can't and won't. By noon, every slave in the work gang has received at least a warning demonstration, and several have graduated to more advanced courses in pain-based motivation. The limestone block continues its journey toward architectural immortality, propelled by a workforce that's been educated in the fundamental principles of Egyptian labor relations: move faster, complain never, and remember that your body belongs to someone else's dreams. Class is always in session, and the tuition is paid in blood. The sun at noon in Egypt doesn't just shine, it attacks. What started as a gentle warming presence at dawn has transformed into a malevolent entity that seems personally offended by your continued existence. The limestone block you're hauling has become a radiator, absorbing heat all morning and now broadcasting it back at you like a furnace designed by someone who really hates slaves. Your skin feels like it's being slow-cooked from the outside in. The Egyptian sun doesn't bother with subtlety. It goes straight for maximum punishment, turning your back into a griddle and your shoulders into kindling. Every inch of exposed flesh screams in protest, as ultraviolet radiation does its work, transforming your epidermis into something that feels like leather that's been left too close to a fire. The rope harness, already a masterpiece of torture engineering, becomes exponentially worse when heated. The hemp fibers, warmed to temperatures that would make bread dough jealous, cut into your flesh with renewed enthusiasm. What were merely rope burns this morning have evolved into legitimate wounds, weeping plasma that immediately evaporates in the heat, leaving behind crystallized salt that feels like ground glass against raw skin. Sweat pours off your body with the enthusiasm of a broken dam, but instead of providing relief, it becomes another instrument of torment. The salt stings every cut, every abrasion, every place where the rope has been educating your nerve endings about the realities of manual labor. Your clothes, soaked through with perspiration, cling to your body like a wet shroud that somehow manages to trap heat while providing no insulation against the sun's assault. The other slaves in your hauling line are performing their own dance with dehydration. The man in front of you sways slightly as he walks, his body beginning the early stages of heat exhaustion. His skin has taken on the waxy pallor of someone whose internal cooling system is fighting a losing battle against the desert. Behind you, someone's breathing has become shallow and rapid, the respiratory equivalent of an engine overheating. But the sun isn't content with merely cooking your outsides. It's also working on your brain. Heat stroke doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. It creeps in quietly, starting with subtle changes in thinking that make dangerous decisions seem reasonable. You find yourself considering whether lying down in the sand might be a good idea, whether the temporary relief would be worth the permanent consequences. These are not the thoughts of a rational mind, but rationality is one of the first casualties of Egyptian noon. The foreman, naturally, has found shade. Not for himself, of course. He's far too dedicated to proper supervision for personal comfort, but for his whip. Leather cracks in extreme heat, and damaged equipment reduces productivity. The slaves, being replaceable, continue working in conditions that would kill camels. The economic logic is flawless. Whips cost money to replace. Slaves just cost effort to drag away. Water becomes more precious than gold, more coveted than freedom, more necessary than hope. The guards occasionally drink from clay vessels, taking long theatrical gulps while making eye contact with the work gangs. It's psychological warfare conducted with hydration, a reminder that liquid refreshment is a privilege reserved for people whose lives have value. Your mouth feels like you've been eating sand, which, given the working conditions, you probably have been. The limestone block, heated by hours of sun exposure, radiates warmth like a boulder-sized oven. Touching it barehanded would result in immediate burns, but the harness system ensures you remain in constant contact with this thermal torture device. The stone seems to mock your suffering, absorbing endless solar energy while reflecting it back at the biological machinery trying to move it. Your vision starts playing tricks as dehydration advances its agenda. The edges of your sight blur occasionally, and sometimes you think you see water where there's only sand. Mirages aren't just optical illusions in the desert, they're cruel jokes played by a sun that's developed a sense of humor about human suffering. The Nile, visible in the distance, might as well be on the moon for all the good it does you. The work pace, which seemed brutal in the morning coolness, becomes actively lethal under the noon sun. But slowing down isn't an option. The foreman's educational methods don't account for heat-related performance issues. His whip speaks the same language regardless of temperature, delivering lessons about productivity that your overheated brain struggles to process. The irony isn't lost on you that increased punishment makes you less capable of the performance being demanded. Other work gangs across the construction site are experiencing their own relationships with solar brutality. Stonecutters work with tools that become too hot to handle, burning their palms while they try to shape blocks for pharaonic immortality. Brickmakers labor over kilns that add their heat to the sun's assault, creating working conditions that would make demons sweat. The entire site has become a testament to human endurance pushed beyond reasonable limits. Your body begins implementing emergency protocols designed by evolution for survival situations that don't include forced labor. Blood flow redirects away from non-essential organs, including your brain, which explains why thinking becomes increasingly difficult. Your kidneys start hoarding water, producing urine the color of weak beer and concentrating enough to etch stone. Your skin stops sweating efficiently, shifting from cooling mode to conservation mode in a biological admission of defeat. The sun reaches its zenith, achieving what meteorologists would call optimal conditions for human suffering. The temperature soars past levels that would shut down any reasonable civilization. But ancient Egypt wasn't built on reasonable standards. It was built on the principle that human endurance has no upper limit, as long as you're willing to accept casualties. The limestone block continues its journey toward architectural immortality, pulled by a collection of biological machines that are slowly cooking in their own fluids. The heat doesn't just make work harder, it makes existence questionable. Every breath feels like inhaling fire. Every step burns through the thin soles, protecting your feet from sand that could fry eggs. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the sun's assault is its reliability. This isn't a temporary condition or an unusual weather event. This is Tuesday in Egypt. Tomorrow will be exactly the same, and the day after that, until either your body adapts to conditions that should kill you, or you join the statistics that make pyramid construction such a labor-intensive industry. The sun doesn't care about your suffering. It doesn't care about your endurance limits or your survival instincts. It just continues its daily routine of turning the Egyptian desert into a solar oven, with you as the main core. Welcome to working conditions that make hell look air-conditioned. You master the technique gradually, without really trying. It starts as a survival mechanism, your mind retreating to safer places while your body continues the mechanical motions of hauling limestone. But somewhere between the morning's first whip crack and the afternoon's heat-induced hallucinations, you discover that you can actually separate yourself from the experience of being you. It's like watching someone else's suffering from a comfortable distance, except the someone else happens to be wearing your skin. The slave 3 positions ahead perfected this art weeks ago. His body moves with the precision of a well-maintained machine, but his eyes hold the empty quality of windows in an abandoned house. He pulls rope, responds to commands, even eats the daily gruel, but something essential has evacuated the premises. The part that used to be human has found better accommodations elsewhere, leaving behind a biological automation that performs slave duties without the inconvenience of conscious suffering. This is what the overseers don't understand about their educational methods. Pain works beautifully for short-term motivation, but extended application teaches slaves to develop immunity through strategic abandonment of self. Why suffer when you can simply not be there? Why feel agony when you can file your consciousness away somewhere safe and let your meat handle the unpleasantness? The technique requires practice. At first, you can only manage brief escapes, moments when your mind slips away to remember what bread used to taste like, or the feeling of choosing when to sleep. But with dedication born of desperation, these absences grow longer. Soon you're spending entire work periods watching your body perform slave labor from the detached perspective of someone viewing a particularly tedious theatrical performance. The limestone block continues its journey, pulled by 20 bodies in various stages of psychological evacuation. Some slaves still inhabit their flesh fully, fighting every step with the passionate resistance of people who believe their suffering matters. Others have achieved partial detachment, present enough to avoid the whip, but absent enough to avoid complete despair. Then there are the masters of the art, the walking dead who've achieved perfect separation between consciousness and consequence. You recognize the progression in yourself. Yesterday, the rope burns felt personal, like injuries happening to you specifically. Today, they're more like weather patterns, affecting a landscape you're observing from a distance. The pain signals still travel from flesh to brain, but they arrive at a destination that's temporarily closed for business. Someone else can handle the screaming nerve endings. You'll be reviewing pleasant memories in a mental space that smells like flowers instead of limestone dust. The sun beats down with its usual malicious enthusiasm. But heat is just another variable, affecting the biological machine you're temporarily not operating. Sweat pours, skin burns, muscles cramp, all fascinating phenomena happening to a body that belongs to someone who isn't currently home. The meat will handle the suffering. Consciousness has better things to do than experience every detail of systematic destruction. This psychological evolution doesn't go unnoticed by the overseers, but they interpret it incorrectly. They see compliance without enthusiasm and mistake it for perfect obedience. What they're actually witnessing is the ultimate slave rebellion. Not physical resistance that can be beaten down, but mental evacuation that renders punishment meaningless. You can't torture someone who isn't there to receive the lesson. The foreman cracks his whip across the back of a slave who's achieved moderate detachment, but the response is delayed, muted, like the reaction of someone being awakened from deep sleep. The physical body jerks appropriately, makes the expected sounds, increases pace according to protocol, but the performance has the hollow quality of theatre performed by actors who've forgotten their motivation. Between your strategic absences, you catch glimpses of the other psychological survival techniques being employed around you. Some slaves have developed selective deafness, their minds filtering out everything except direct commands necessary for survival. Others practice selective blindness, seeing only what's required for their immediate tasks, while missing the broader context of their situation. A few have mastered selective memory, forgetting their past lives so completely that slavery feels like the natural order, rather than a brutal deviation from human dignity. The most advanced practitioners have learned to subdivide their consciousness, keeping just enough awareness present to perform required functions, while filing away everything else in mental storage that's inaccessible to Egyptian supervision. They've created internal refugee camps where the parts of themselves that remember being human can wait out the occupation of their bodies by pharaonic labor demands. You experiment with these techniques, discovering that the key is finding the minimum level of presence required to avoid fatal mistakes, while maximizing absence from the experience of making those mistakes. It's like learning to operate complicated machinery while sleepwalking, maintaining just enough connection to avoid walking into walls while dreaming of better places. The limestone block reaches the base of the ramp, and the angle changes from merely difficult to genuinely impossible. Physics suggests that 20 slaves can't drag 3,000 pounds up a 15-degree incline, but economics disagrees. The solution, you discover, is to not be present for the physics lesson. Let the body deal with the impossible mathematics. Consciousness has appointments elsewhere. The afternoon stretches ahead like a particularly tedious form of eternity, but time becomes negotiable when you're not fully committed to experiencing it. Minutes can be skipped. Hours can be fast-forwarded. Entire workdays can be filed under someone else's problem, while you attend to more pleasant business in mental spaces that don't include whips, ropes, or limestone blocks. This is how you survive slavery, not by enduring it, but by strategically not being there for it. Your body continues its career as human construction equipment, while your consciousness develops a successful consulting business in psychological absence. The overseers get their productivity, the pharaoh gets his monument, and you get to preserve something essential by storing it somewhere they can't reach. The art of dying while still breathing isn't death at all. It's the ultimate expression of life refusing to be completely conquered. They can own your body, control your actions, dictate your schedule, but the part that makes you human has learned to commute to work from a safe distance. Someone else can handle the suffering. You've got better things to do. The overseer's whistle cuts through the air like a dying bird, signaling what the administration generously calls the midday rest period. This isn't a lunch break in any civilized sense. It's more like a tactical pause in the day's assault on human dignity, designed to keep the biological machinery functional long enough to complete afternoon quotas. The limestone block stops moving, not because anyone cares about your comfort, but because even slave labor requires occasional maintenance to prevent total system failure. You collapse where you stand, still tangled in the rope harness that's been redesigning your circulatory system all morning. The hemp cord has achieved a perfect fusion with your skin, creating patterns of rope burn that will serve as permanent reminders of today's achievements in human hauling. Removing the harness would require energy you don't possess, and medical attention that doesn't exist. So you simply shift position enough to reduce the pressure on whatever nerve endings still have opinions about pain. Around you, 19 other members of the human towing service perform their own versions of controlled collapse. Some remain standing, having learnt that sitting down requires strength they'll need for getting back up. Others sprawl in whatever configuration their bodies assume when structural integrity finally surrenders. The smart ones seek the meager shade provided by the limestone block itself, ironic shelter offered by the instrument of their torture. The meal that arrives wouldn't qualify as food in any culture that values human life. A clay vessel appears, carried by slaves whose job description includes nourishment distribution but excludes quality control. The contents slosh with the consistency of liquid disappointment, a watery gruel that makes the morning's breakfast seem luxurious by comparison. This midday offering has achieved the remarkable feat of being simultaneously too thin to chew and too thick to drink comfortably. You receive your portion in a wooden bowl that's been recycled through so many meals, it's developed its own ecosystem. The surface carries the accumulated flavors of 1,000 previous servings, none of them pleasant. The gruel itself tastes like someone dissolved yesterday's leftover disappointment in water that's seen better centuries, then seasoned it with the ground-up hopes of people who used to believe in better days. But taste becomes irrelevant when the alternative is collapse from malnutrition. You force the substance down your throat with the mechanical efficiency of someone refueling a machine, because that's essentially what this process represents. This isn't dining, it's maintenance. The liquid provides just enough calories to keep your muscles contracting and your brain functioning at the minimum level required for following orders. The water ration arrives separately, carried in vessels that suggest someone understands the concept of hydration without grasping the reality of human needs. Each slave receives approximately half a cup of liquid that tastes like it was filtered through sand, flavored with clay, and seasoned with the tears of whoever was responsible for quality control. It's enough to prevent immediate death from dehydration, but insufficient to replace what the morning's labor extracted from your body. You drink it in small sips, trying to make the precious liquid last while your body screams for more. The water hits your stomach like salvation mixed with sand, providing temporary relief from the desert that's taken up residence in your mouth. Your kidneys celebrate this brief influx of moisture by producing urine the color of weak tea, a biological achievement that suggests your internal organs are operating on emergency protocols. The contrast with the free workers' midday experience plays out 30 yards away like a theatrical performance designed to illustrate the difference between human beings and human property. Their meal arrives on actual plates, accompanied by bread that remembers what wheat tastes like, vegetables that died recently enough to retain nutritional value, and beer that's been properly fermented rather than merely hoped into existence. These free laborers sit in constructed shade, protected by canvas shelters that acknowledge the sun's hostility toward human comfort. They talk while they eat, sharing jokes and complaints with the casual ease of people whose opinions matter to someone. Some even nap after eating, resting in positions they've chosen rather than collapsed into. The distance between their experience and yours might as well be measured in different universes. The rest period provides an opportunity to catalogue the morning's damage to your physical plant. The rope burns have achieved new depths of creativity, carving patterns into your skin that would be artistic if they weren't quite so agonizing. Your shoulders have developed bruises in colors that don't occur naturally in human flesh, ranging from purple to yellow to that particular shade of green that suggests internal bleeding has achieved an artistic breakthrough. Your hands, gripping rope for hours, have evolved beyond mere calluses into something resembling geological formations. The skin has thickened into protective plates separated by cracks deep enough to hide small coins. Your palms weep clear fluid that immediately crystallizes in the heat, creating a self-sealing system that prevents complete skin failure while ensuring every grip remains painful. The feet present their own catalogue of environmental adaptation. Walking on hot sand while hauling impossible weights has taught your souls to develop survival strategies that would impress evolution itself. Blisters form, pop, and reform in cycles, timed to the rhythm of limestone hauling. The skin thickens into protective padding that simultaneously cushions impact and transmits every sharp stone directly to your already overstimulated nervous system. But perhaps the most telling damage isn't visible on your skin. It's the change in how you think about time. Minutes have become geological epochs. Hours stretch like prison sentences, and the concept of afternoon looms ahead like a mountain range of suffering that needs climbing one agonizing step at a time. Your brain has rewired itself to process pain as background noise, while calculating the energy reserves needed to survive until evening collapse. The whistle sounds again, cutting short whatever recovery your body managed during the break. The limestone block awaits, patient as death and twice as inevitable. The rope harness calls to your shoulders with the enthusiasm of a torturer who's just returned from vacation. The afternoon shift beckons with promises of heat that will make the morning seem cool and labor that will make the previous hours feel like gentle exercise. Time to discover what your body can endure when it's already operating beyond reasonable limits. Time to find out if human machinery can function on disappointment, determination when proper fuel isn't available. Time to resume your career in biological construction equipment. The intermission is over. The real show is about to begin. The pecking order in slavery makes prison social structure look like a sophisticated diplomatic protocol. At the top of your particular food chain sits the chief overseer, a man whose authority extends to life and death decisions, and whose morning routine apparently includes practicing creative applications of Egyptian justice. He doesn't dirty his hands with day-to-day slave management. That's beneath his administrative dignity, but his presence carries the weight of absolute power backed by institutional brutality. Below him, the foremen occupy the middle management tier of human suffering, each responsible for specific aspects of the construction project, and each armed with whips that have seen more action than war chariots. These men have perfected the art of motivating human machinery through strategic applications of leather and intimidation. They understand the economics of slave labor, maximum productivity with minimum investment in worker welfare. Then come the section supervisors, former slaves who've earned promotion through a combination of survival skills and moral flexibility. These men represent the most depressing aspect of the hierarchy, proof that given enough brutality, humans will cooperate in their own oppression if it means staying alive. They know exactly what slavery feels like, which makes them either more sympathetic or more vicious than their never-enslaved colleagues, depending on how the experience affected their remaining humanity. The guard contingent operates as the enforcement arm of this organizational chart. Men whose job description includes violence application and casualty disposal. They patrol the worksite with the lazy confidence of predators in a target-rich environment, always ready to demonstrate why cooperation is preferable to resistance. Their weapons aren't ceremonial. The dark stains on various clubs and spear points tell stories about previous educational sessions. At the bottom of the official hierarchy, you'll find the general slave population, subdivided into categories that determine life expectancy and suffering intensity. The stone cutters occupy a relatively privileged position because their skills require training and experience. Dead stone cutters are expensive to replace. They work with tools sharp enough to be dangerous, which means they receive slightly better treatment to prevent carved limestone from becoming carved overseers. The haulers, your own prestigious category, rank somewhere between livestock and machinery in the administrative mind. You're strong enough to move heavy objects but not skilled enough to be irreplaceable. This makes you perfect for the kind of work that breaks bodies systematically while requiring minimal investment in training or equipment. When haulers collapse, replacement is simply a matter of selecting the next available warm body. Below the haulers, you'll find the brickmakers. Slaves assigned to work that combines the respiratory hazards of constant dust inhalation with the repetitive stress injuries of molding clay all day. Their life expectancy is measured in seasons rather than years, but the work requires no skill, which makes them easily replaceable from the steady stream of fresh slaves arriving from conquered territories. At the very bottom of the official structure are the cleanup crews. Slaves whose job involves dealing with the byproducts of pyramid construction that nobody wants to think about. They handle waste disposal, body removal, and the kind of maintenance work that keeps construction sites functional, but requires constant exposure to substances that would make hardened soldiers queasy. These positions are typically assigned to slaves who've committed disciplinary infractions or simply had the misfortune of being available when unpleasant work needed doing. But the official hierarchy doesn't capture the complete social structure operating within the slave population itself. Among the slaves, survival-based mini-hierarchies develop based on factors the overseers don't recognize or care about. Length of service creates natural leadership. Slaves who've survived multiple seasons develop knowledge that can mean the difference between making it through another day and becoming tomorrow's casualty statistics. Physical condition determines access to information and resources. Slaves who can still perform heavy labor receive slightly larger food portions and better sleeping spots. Those whose bodies are failing get pushed toward the margins, where survival becomes a solo effort rather than a group activity. Arithmetic is brutal, but practical. Helping a failing slave reduces your own chances of survival. Skills that aren't officially recognized still carry weight in the underground economy that develops wherever humans are forced together under impossible conditions. A slave who can treat injuries, repair equipment, or predict weather patterns becomes valuable to his fellow sufferers, even if that value doesn't translate into official status. These informal specialists operate a shadow support system that makes survival marginally more possible. Then there are the collaborators, slaves who've decided that cooperation with the system offers better survival prospects than solidarity with their fellow sufferers. They report conversations, identify potential troublemakers, and generally serve as the eyes and ears of the administrative structure in exchange for minor privileges. These informants represent the most complex moral category in the slave hierarchy, simultaneously despised and understood by people who recognize that survival sometimes requires choices that normal morality can't accommodate. The newest arrivals occupy the bottom of every hierarchy, official and unofficial. Fresh slaves haven't learned the survival skills, haven't developed the psychological adaptations, and haven't earned the trust necessary for inclusion in mutual support networks. They die at rates that would horrify actuaries, serving as both cautionary examples and statistical proof that slavery is designed as a grinding machine that processes human lives into construction progress. Language barriers create additional stratification within the slave population. Egyptians who've fallen into slavery through debt or crime share cultural knowledge that provides survival advantages. Foreign slaves from various conquered territories struggle with communication problems that can be literally fatal when understanding orders incorrectly results in punishment severe enough to end careers in human machinery. Age affects position in ways that would be heartbreaking if you had energy left for heartbreak. Children born into slavery grow up thinking this nightmare is normal life, which gives them certain advantages in adaptation, but robs them of any concept that existence could be different. Older slaves who remember freedom carry psychological burdens that younger ones don't. But they also possess knowledge about life outside the construction site that can provide motivation for survival. The women slaves occupy their own separate hell within the larger hell, facing additional challenges that the male population doesn't encounter, but suffering under the same basic arithmetic of survival. Their hierarchies operate according to different rules, influenced by factors that the male slaves can observe but not fully understand from their own position in the system. At the very top of the unofficial hierarchy are the survivors, slaves who've lasted long enough to develop institutional knowledge, political awareness, and the kind of cynical wisdom that comes from watching hundreds of people die while figuring out how to avoid joining them. These veterans don't lead in any traditional sense, but they provide the continuity that keeps slave society functional enough to support group survival. Understanding your position in these various hierarchies becomes essential for navigation of daily life. Too high and you attract unwanted attention from overseers who don't want slaves developing leadership qualities. Too low and you lose access to the informal support systems that can make the difference between surviving today and becoming tomorrow's cleanup project. You're somewhere in the middle of most rankings. Experienced enough to be useful, strong enough to be valuable, but not prominent enough to be dangerous. It's a position that maximizes survival probability, while minimizing the kind of visibility that draws administrative attention. In the mathematics of slavery, anonymity is the most precious commodity. The morning prayer ritual happens while you're still tangled in rope harnesses, because apparently the gods appreciate multitasking. The priest arrives with all the pomp that religious ceremony requires, carrying sacred objects that probably cost more than your entire work gang's collective value. He's here to bless the construction project, ensure divine approval for pharaonic immortality, and remind everyone that the gods are fully supportive of the current arrangements regarding human suffering. The irony isn't lost on you that the same deities supposedly responsible for justice, protection, and human welfare are being invoked to sanctify a project built on systematic torture. Ra, the sun god, gets special recognition for providing the light that makes work possible. Though notably, nobody mentions his role in creating working conditions that regularly kill people through heat exhaustion. Pa, patron of craftsmen, receives gratitude for inspiring the architectural vision. Apparently, his definition of craftsmanship includes using human beings as construction equipment. The priest's chanting carries across the work site with all the musical appeal of fingernails on limestone. His words invoke divine blessing for the pharaoh's eternal rest, request protection for the sacred construction, and ask for continued productivity from the workforce. Nowhere in this religious performance does anyone petition the gods for mercy toward the slaves, relief from suffering, or even basic survival support. The divine attention is exclusively focused on architectural success and royal comfort. Soph, god of wisdom and knowledge, presumably approves of the engineering calculations that determine how many slaves need to die per pyramid block. Anubis, guardian of the dead, must be working overtime processing the steady stream of casualties that pyramid construction generates. Mamat, goddess of truth and justice, apparently defines justice as a system where some humans own other humans and work them to death for architectural glory. The religious hierarchy operating on the construction site mirrors the administrative structure with depressing precision. High priests enjoy the same privileged status as chief overseers, intermediate clergy rank with foremen, and the lowest religious functionaries barely outrank the slaves themselves. This parallel structure ensures that divine authority reinforces earthly oppression, creating a seamless system where rebellion against slavery becomes rebellion against the gods themselves. The temple complex visible in the distance represents the ultimate insult to anyone suffering under Egyptian religious logic. Massive resources flow toward buildings designed to house gods who apparently require gold-plated accommodations while their supposed children work themselves to death in the sun. These divine residences feature luxury that would make pharaohs jealous, funded by the same economic system that can't afford adequate food for the slaves building them. Between prayer sessions, various religious officials tour the construction site to ensure proper spiritual compliance. They examine the work progress, consult with overseers about productivity, and occasionally perform blessings on equipment that's functioning well. The slaves receive no similar attention. Apparently, divine concern doesn't extend to the welfare of human machinery, only to the success of the projects that machinery enables. The most spiritually gifted among the slaves sometimes attempt private prayers to these same gods, hoping that personal appeals might receive more sympathetic attention than mass religious ceremonies. These desperate communications typically request basic survival support: enough food to work, enough water to live, enough strength to endure another day. The response rate to these prayers appears to be approximately zero, but hope dies harder than bodies, and some slaves continue their optimistic theology right up until their final collapse. Certain gods receive special attention from the slave population, though not always for orthodox reasons. Osiris, ruler of the underworld, becomes particularly relevant when contemplating whether death might offer better working conditions than life. His domain starts looking attractive when existence becomes an extended exercise in systematic torture. Isis, associated with healing and protection, gets frequent requests for intervention that consistently go unanswered. The festival calendar provides additional opportunities to observe divine priorities in action. Religious celebrations throughout the year commemorate various gods with elaborate ceremonies that consume resources, while slaves work through the festivities. Food that could feed hundreds of laborers gets burned as offerings to deities who apparently prefer smoke to human survival. Beer that could prevent dehydration gets poured on temple floors to honor gods who seem unconcerned about their worshippers dying of thirst. Some slaves develop theological frameworks that attempt to reconcile divine benevolence with earthly brutality. They theorize that suffering serves some greater spiritual purpose, that their current agony represents payment for past sins, or that enduring slavery demonstrates faith worthy of eventual reward. These explanations help maintain sanity, but require impressive mental gymnastics to reconcile loving gods with systematic torture. Other slaves adopt a more practical theological approach, abandoning any expectation of divine intervention while maintaining religious observance as protective camouflage. They participate in required ceremonies, mouth the appropriate prayer, and demonstrate proper reverence while privately concluding that the gods are either powerless, evil, or fictional. This pragmatic atheism allows survival without the psychological burden of expecting help that never arrives. The afterlife promises promoted by Egyptian religion become particularly bitter jokes when viewed from slave perspective. Eternal paradise awaits those who live righteous lives and receive proper burial rites, both conditions that seem deliberately designed to exclude people who die from exhaustion while building monuments they'll never see completed. The religious system offers eternal rewards while ensuring that slaves can't meet the requirements for receiving them. The mummification process represents the ultimate religious mockery of slave existence. Enormous resources go toward preserving the bodies of nobles for eternal life, while slave corpses get thrown into pits without ceremony. The same gods who require elaborate preservation rituals for the wealthy apparently don't mind if their poorer worshippers decompose in mass graves. Divine standards for post-mortem care correlate perfectly with earthly economic status. Personal religious items among the slaves tend toward the desperately practical rather than the spiritually sophisticated. A small charm that might provide protection from accidents, an amulet that could ward off disease, a prayer inscription that requests basic survival. These represent the grassroots theological priorities of people whose spiritual needs have been reduced to immediate survival concerns. The priest completes his blessing ceremony and departs for more comfortable assignments, leaving behind slaves who've been officially sanctified for another day of systematic destruction. The gods have given their approval for continued human suffering in service of architectural immortality. Divine blessing has been confirmed for a project that will kill hundreds more people before completion. The irony would be funny if it weren't quite so deadly. The same religious system that promises divine love and protection has officially endorsed treating humans like construction equipment. The gods who supposedly created people in their image apparently don't mind seeing those images broken systematically for royal construction projects. But perhaps the cruelest theological joke is that the slaves continue working, continue suffering, and continue dying to build monuments that will honor gods who've demonstrated complete indifference to their welfare. Faith persists even when divine attention obviously doesn't. Hope survives even when divine intervention consistently fails to materialize. The gods have spoken. They want their monuments built. The cost in human suffering is apparently acceptable to divine sensibilities. Prayer session over. Back to being construction equipment with delusions of humanity. The woman working in the brick-making section catches your attention during the brief water distribution, and immediately you realize you've made a potentially fatal mistake. Attraction in slavery isn't romance. It's a survival liability that can get both participants killed if the wrong people notice. But there she is, arms covered in clay dust, hair tied back with a strip of cloth that might once have been colorful, and eyes that still hold something the Egyptian sun hasn't managed to burn out of them. She's beautiful in the way that flowers growing through sidewalk cracks are beautiful, not because the conditions are favorable, but because beauty persists despite everything trying to destroy it. Her face carries the worn exhaustion that marks all long-term slaves, but underneath the fatigue there's still something recognizably human. In a world where humanity gets systematically beaten out of people, that's more attractive than any physical perfection. The mathematics of slave romance are brutally simple. You're both property belonging to the same owner, which means any relationship exists at the pleasure of people who view you as livestock. Livestock that reproduces creates more livestock, which has economic value, but livestock that forms emotional attachments becomes harder to manage. Administrative preference is for breeding without bonding, reproduction without romance, sexual function without human connection. You learn her name through the underground communication network that operates beneath official supervision. She's called Nebet, which means lady in Egyptian, a name that carries bitter irony when attached to someone who's literally owned by other people. Names become precious in slavery because they're often the only possession that can't be taken away, the last vestige of individual identity in a system designed to reduce people to anonymous labor units. Communication happens in stolen moments between work assignments, brief exchanges during meal distribution, and the kind of meaningful glances that develop their own vocabulary when spoken words are too dangerous. You learn that she was captured during a border raid 2 years ago, sold to cover her village's tribute obligations, and assigned to brickmaking because her hands were already trained in pottery work. Her story is typical slave biography, personal disaster converted into someone else's profit. The attraction becomes mutual, which multiplies the danger exponentially. Two slaves forming emotional connections represent a potential security risk that overseers are trained to identify and eliminate. Bonded slaves might prioritize each other's welfare over productivity quotas. They might coordinate resistance activities. They might even attempt escape together, which requires planning and cooperation that threatens the entire disciplinary system. Physical intimacy in slavery isn't romance in any traditional sense. It's stolen moments of human connection, conditions that actively discourage humanity. Privacy doesn't exist when you sleep in barracks with 20 other people under constant supervision. Affection becomes a luxury measured in seconds rather than hours, expressed through touches that could be mistaken for accidental contact and conversations that sound like work coordination to casual observers. The irony isn't lost on you that falling in love under these conditions represents both the ultimate expression of human resilience and the most dangerous possible behavior. Love proves that the essential human spirit survives even systematic attempts to destroy it, but it also creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by people who understand that emotional connections make slaves easier to control through threatened consequences. You discover that hope changes flavor when it's shared. Individual survival becomes joint survival, which requires different strategies and creates different risks. Two people trying to keep each other alive have twice as many opportunities for failure and twice as many reasons to succeed. The emotional mathematics become complicated when you're calculating not just your own survival probability but someone else's welfare in every decision. The guards notice eventually, because guards are paid to notice behavioral changes that might indicate security problems. They don't intervene immediately. The initial approach is observation and assessment, determining whether this particular emotional connection poses a management threat or represents an opportunity for improved control. Slaves with emotional attachments become more compliant when properly motivated through threats to their loved ones. Sexual relationships among slaves exist in a grey area of official policy. Rape by guards and overseers happens regularly and is considered a job perk rather than a crime. Consensual relationships between slaves are sometimes tolerated as a management tool. Bonded slaves work harder to protect each other and are less likely to attempt escape when it means abandoning their partners. But the tolerance extends only as far as administrative convenience. The pregnancy that eventually results from your relationship changes the entire calculation. Pregnant slaves represent both economic opportunity and management challenge. A successful pregnancy produces another slave, which has long-term value, but pregnancy also reduces immediate productivity and requires resource allocation for prenatal care. The economic analysis determines whether the relationship continues or gets terminated through reassignment. The administrative decision treats your emotional connection as a livestock breeding program rather than a human relationship. Nabate gets transferred to the women's quarters where pregnant slaves receive marginally better food and reduced work assignments. Not because anyone cares about her welfare, but because protecting the investment in future slave production makes economic sense. The transfer separates you geographically while keeping you both within the same facility, maintaining the emotional connection while preventing regular contact. You learn to measure love in glimpses caught across construction sites, brief conversations during shift changes, and the knowledge that someone else's survival has become more important than your own. This isn't romance in any conventional sense. It's human connection maintained despite systematic efforts to prevent it. Emotional bonding that survives conditions designed to make such bonding impossible. The child born from this relationship becomes both blessing and curse. Another human life brought into slavery represents the system's ultimate victory. Love converted into additional property. Reproduction serving the interests of people who own your family, but the child also represents hope in its purest form. Proof that life continues even under conditions that should make continuation impossible. Years pass, measured not in anniversaries, but in survival milestones. The child grows up thinking slavery is normal life, which breaks your heart while simultaneously ensuring better psychological adaptation to conditions that would destroy someone who remembered freedom. Your relationship with Nibit evolves into something deeper than romance. Partnership in the most essential sense. Two people sharing the burden of keeping each other alive long enough to raise a child who might, possibly, somehow find a better life. The love doesn't conquer the slavery, doesn't provide escape from the brutality, doesn't offer protection from the systematic destruction of human dignity, but it provides something that pure survival instinct can't. A reason to continue existing that extends beyond mere biological persistence. Love in slavery becomes less about happiness and more about maintaining humanity under conditions designed to eliminate it. The administrative system eventually adapts to accommodate your family unit, because stable slave families produce better long-term productivity than isolated individual slaves. The emotional connections that initially seemed like security risks become management tools, providing leverage for maintaining compliance and motivation for continued cooperation. But late at night, when the guards are elsewhere, and the child sleeps between you and Nebi, in quarters barely large enough for two people, the system's calculations become irrelevant. In those stolen moments, you're not property or livestock or human machinery. You're people who found each other in hell and decided that connection was worth the additional suffering it caused. Love in slavery doesn't triumph over oppression. It just proves that humanity persists in conditions designed to eliminate it completely. The first rule of slave healthcare in ancient Egypt is simple. There isn't any. When your economic status ranks somewhere between livestock and construction equipment, medical attention becomes a luxury reserved for breakdowns that threaten productivity rather than suffering that merely reduces efficiency. The Egyptian medical system, renowned throughout the ancient world for its sophistication, operates on the principle that healing resources should be allocated based on the patient's value to society, and slaves don't qualify. The infirmary exists. Technically, it's a mud brick building located conveniently close to the construction site, equipped with basic medical supplies and staffed by someone who's learnt enough anatomy to distinguish between injuries that can be fixed and injuries that require replacement personnel. But calling it a medical facility requires a generous interpretation of the word medical and a complete abandonment of any concept related to care. The person running this establishment holds the title healer, with the same authority that brickmakers hold the title craftsman. Technically accurate, but fundamentally misleading about the actual scope of professional competence. He's learned to set broken bones, stitch major wounds, and identify diseases that might spread to more valuable members of society. His diagnostic capabilities center around determining whether a slave can return to work tomorrow, next week, or never. You discover his services after a limestone block shifts unexpectedly during hauling, pinning your leg against a wooden roller with the efficiency of a torture device designed by someone who really understands leverage. The pain shoots through your nervous system like lightning through wet metal, announcing that several important structural components of your locomotion system have been compromised. The other slaves in your hauling team continue working. Stopping to help would just mean more injuries when the block settles improperly. The walk to the infirmary becomes an educational experience in human biomechanics. You learn that legs have backup systems for weight bearing, that pain can achieve intensities you didn't know existed, and that the body's natural response to major injury is to flood your brain with chemicals that make rational thought impossible. By the time you reach the medical facility, you're operating on automatic pilot, while your consciousness deals with the more immediate problem of not screaming loud enough to attract unwanted attention. The healer examines your leg with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating damaged equipment. His hands probe the injury with practiced efficiency, checking for broken bones, torn muscles, and other structural failures that might affect operational capacity. The examination focuses entirely on mechanical function, whether the leg can bear weight, support movement, and perform the basic operations required for hauling limestone. Concepts like comfort or pain management don't appear in his diagnostic framework. His prognosis is delivered with the emotional engagement of someone reading inventory reports. Bone isn't broken, muscle isn't torn completely. Swelling will reduce productivity for several days. No mention of how much it hurts. No acknowledgement that walking feels like stepping on broken glass. No recognition that your leg has developed its own rhythm of agony that doesn't match the rest of your body's timing. The treatment consists of a splint made from construction scraps, a bandage that's been recycled through previous patients, and instructions to work lighter until the injury heals. No pain medication, because drugs cost money And slave suffering doesn't qualify as a medical condition, no bed rest, because horizontal slaves don't contribute to pyramid construction, no follow-up appointments, because healing is expected to happen on your own time without interfering with work schedules. The medical supplies available for slave treatment represent the absolute bottom tier of Egyptian pharmaceutical technology. Bandages made from cloth too worn for household use, splints crafted from construction waste, and medicinal preparations that consist mainly of substances that happen to be available rather than substances known to be effective. The economic logic is flawless. Why waste quality medical resources on people whose replacement costs less than their treatment? Other slaves in the facility are receiving similar high-quality healthcare. A stonecutter with a hand crushed by falling blocks gets a bandage and instructions to find work that doesn't require finger dexterity. A hauler suffering from heat exhaustion receives water, actual water, not just permission to drink. And a lecture about working more efficiently in extreme temperatures. A brickmaker with respiratory problems from constant dust inhalation gets advice about breathing through cloth and a prediction that he'll probably die within the year. The contrast with medical care available to free Egyptians plays out in the same building, separated by a cloth partition that might as well divide different universes. Beyond that barrier, patients receive examinations by physicians who've studied medicine as a science rather than learning it as a trade skill. They get beds for recovery, pain medications that actually reduce suffering, and treatment plans that prioritize healing over productivity. You hear conversations through the partition about surgical procedures, herbal remedies, and healing techniques that sound like magic compared to the mechanical maintenance you're receiving. Free patients discuss their symptoms with healers who ask about comfort levels, pain intensity, and quality of life. Their treatment focuses on restoring health, rather than merely returning people to functional status for continued exploitation. The Egyptian medical system has developed sophisticated treatments for conditions affecting valuable members of society, surgical procedures that can save lives, pharmaceutical preparations that can cure diseases, and diagnostic techniques that can identify problems before they become fatal. None of these advances benefit the slave population, which receives healthcare based on veterinary principles. Keep the animals functional enough to work, dispose of those that can't be repaired economically. Infectious diseases present special challenges in slave medical management. Conditions that might spread to free Egyptians receive immediate attention and aggressive treatment. Diseases that only affect the slave population get monitored for economic impact rather than human suffering. The calculation is always the same. Does treating this condition cost more than replacing the affected slaves? The pharmaceutical preparations available to slaves represent the clearance rack of Egyptian medicine. Expired medications, failed experimental treatments, and preparations made from ingredients too poor quality for use on paying patients. These substances might help, might have no effect, or might actually make conditions worse. But they're free, which makes them appropriate for people whose lives have no monetary value. Mental health doesn't exist as a concept in slave medical practice. Psychological trauma from systematic brutality, depression from hopeless living conditions, and anxiety from constant fear of death are considered normal responses to slavery rather than medical conditions requiring treatment. The assumption is that slaves who can't handle the psychological pressure should be replaced rather than treated. Recovery happens entirely on your own time and without interfering with work productivity. The healing process must accommodate the demands of limestone hauling rather than limestone hauling accommodating the needs of healing. You learn to work with injuries that haven't healed, to function with pain that doesn't subside, and to maintain productivity while your body attempts repairs under impossible conditions. The most sophisticated medical technology available to slaves is the human body's own healing capacity. Your immune system, pain tolerance, and cellular repair mechanisms become your primary healthcare providers, working overtime to maintain functionality under conditions that actively oppose recovery. Evolution didn't design human physiology for slavery, but natural selection has a way of favoring people whose bodies can adapt to systematic abuse. The leg heals eventually, after weeks of working through pain that would sideline any free Egyptian for months. The bone knits itself back together despite constant stress. The muscles rebuild despite inadequate nutrition, and the swelling subsides despite continued trauma. Your body accomplishes medical miracles through sheer biological determination, achieving recovery that would impress Egyptian physicians if they bothered to notice slave resilience. But the injury leaves permanent changes in how you move, work, and experience daily life. The leg never regains full strength, developing a persistent ache that serves as a weather prediction system, and a reminder that your body is accumulating damage faster than it can repair itself. Each injury adds to the cumulative total of physical compromise that defines long-term slave survival. The underground medical system that develops among slaves operates on principles that Egyptian medicine doesn't recognize: shared knowledge, mutual aid, and treatment approaches based on what's available rather than what's ideal. Slaves who've survived various injuries become informal medical consultants, offering advice based on personal experience rather than formal training. Their recommendations often work better than official treatment because they understand the constraints of healing while continuing forced labor. Folk remedies circulate through the slave population like contraband, passed along with whispered instructions about preparation and application: herbs that grow wild near the construction site, clay preparations that reduce inflammation, and techniques for managing pain without interfering with work productivity. These treatments exist outside official medical oversight, which makes them both potentially dangerous and occasionally life-saving. The most valuable medical knowledge among slaves involves recognizing which injuries can be hidden from supervisors and which require official attention. Working through minor damage prevents unwanted medical consultation that might result in being declared unfit for continued labor, but concealing major injuries risks permanent disability that could end your career in human machinery. The calculation requires expertise that no Egyptian medical school teaches. Chronic conditions develop gradually, creating medical challenges that the official healthcare system doesn't acknowledge. Respiratory problems from constant dust inhalation, joint deterioration from repetitive stress, and nutritional deficiencies from inadequate diet accumulate over time, reducing functional capacity while remaining technically invisible to supervisors who only recognize acute injuries. The female slaves face additional medical challenges that the male-dominated healthcare system either ignores or treats as livestock management issues. Pregnancy and childbirth happen without medical support beyond what's necessary to preserve economic value. Gynecological problems receive attention only when they threaten reproductive capacity. The medical needs specific to women exist in a category that Egyptian medicine doesn't recognize as requiring professional attention. Pain becomes a constant companion that you learn to accommodate rather than treat. Chronic discomfort from old injuries, ongoing inflammation from current damage, and the daily accumulation of new trauma create a background level of suffering that defines normal existence. The concept of being pain-free becomes as foreign as the concept of being free in any other sense. The medical facility's real function becomes clear over time. It's not designed to heal slaves, but to identify which ones are still economically viable. The examinations focus on productivity potential rather than health restoration. Treatment aims for functional adequacy rather than recovery. The entire system operates on the principle that slave bodies are replaceable equipment rather than human beings deserving care. Death in the medical facility happens with the same administrative efficiency that characterizes everything else about slave management. Bodies are removed quickly to prevent demoralization among remaining patients. No records are kept of slave deaths. No statistics compiled about survival rates. No analysis conducted of treatment effectiveness. Slaves who die during medical treatment simply disappear from the administrative records, replaced by new arrivals from the constant stream of captured peoples. The psychological impact of slave healthcare extends beyond physical suffering, to include the systematic dehumanization inherent in being treated as malfunctioning equipment. Every interaction with the medical system reinforces the message that your life has value only insofar as it serves someone else's purposes. Pain relief, comfort, care, and healing become luxuries reserved for people whose lives actually matter. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of slave medicine is how it forces you to become complicit in your own dehumanization. You learn to minimize symptoms to avoid unwanted attention, to work through injuries that require rest, and to accept inadequate treatment as the best available option. The system teaches you to value your own suffering less than your productivity, to treat your body as equipment rather than as the vessel of your humanity. Recovery becomes a solo effort that happens despite the medical system rather than because of it. Your body heals using whatever resources it can mobilize. Your pain tolerance expands to accommodate conditions that should require intervention, and your definition of health adjusts to match what's possible under impossible circumstances. The leg that was injured months ago still aches when it rains, still wobbles under maximum load, and still reminds you daily that medical care in slavery is designed to maintain functionality rather than restore health. But it carries you through another day of limestone hauling, another step towards survival, another small victory of human resilience over systematic brutality. Medical care for slaves, where healing happens in spite of the healthcare system, not because of it. The ledger that determines your fate sits in an office you'll never see, maintained by a scribe, whose job involves calculating the precise monetary value of human suffering. Your existence has been reduced to numbers: acquisition cost, daily maintenance expense, productivity output, depreciation rate, and eventual disposal value. The mathematics of slavery operate with the cold efficiency of any other business accounting, except the inventory happens to breathe and occasionally complain about working conditions. Your purchase price was recorded as 12 silver pieces, which represented a bargain in the regional slave market. Fresh captures from border raids typically cost more, but you were part of a bulk transaction that allowed for volume discounting. The trader who sold you threw in a group rate that reduced per unit costs, demonstrating the kind of business efficiency that makes Egyptian commerce the envy of neighboring kingdoms. You're essentially a wholesale human, bought in bulk to reduce overhead. The daily operational costs of maintaining one slave have been calculated with actuarial precision. Food allocation: 1/4 silver piece per day for grain-based nutrition that meets minimum caloric requirements for heavy labor. Water provision, included in facility overhead costs, since the well serves multiple purposes, and slave hydration represents a rounding error in total consumption. Housing, approximately 1/15 silver piece daily for sleeping space in shared quarters that maximize occupancy efficiency. Medical expenses average 1/10 silver piece per slave per month, including the cost of basic wound treatment, bone setting, and replacement of slaves who die from work-related injury. This calculation assumes that most medical problems will resolve themselves through natural healing or natural selection, keeping professional intervention to an absolute minimum. The budget includes no allowance for pain management, comfort care, or treatment of conditions that don't directly impact productivity. Your daily productivity output gets measured in limestone blocks moved, distance hauled, and construction progress achieved. The accounting department has determined that an average slave can move the equivalent of 1/2 silver piece worth of construction materials per day under optimal conditions. This figure accounts for variations in weather, slave health, and the occasional need to replace equipment that breaks down during operation. Equipment being the slaves, not the ropes and pulleys. The depreciation schedule for human property follows standard Egyptian accounting practices for livestock and machinery. New slaves retain full value for approximately 6 months, assuming proper maintenance and reasonable working conditions. After that, depreciation accelerates based on accumulated wear, injury history, and behavioral compliance. Most slaves are written down to 50% of purchase value within 2 years, with complete depreciation occurring at death or disposal. Replacement costs vary depending on market conditions and the specific skills required. General laborers like yourself can be replaced for approximately the same price as original acquisition. Thanks to steady supply from military campaigns and economic disruption in neighboring territories, skilled workers cost more, but also depreciate more slowly, creating different economic calculations for different categories of human property. The profit margin on slave labor represents one of the most successful business models in Egyptian history. Initial investment of 12 silver pieces generates approximately 18 months of productive output worth roughly 100 silver pieces, assuming normal depreciation rates and typical work-related mortality, even accounting for maintenance costs, medical expenses, and eventual replacement. the return on investment exceeds 300% over the useful life of the asset. The accounting system treats slave deaths as normal business expenses rather than tragedies requiring investigation. Actuarial tables predict that approximately 15% of the slave workforce will die annually from work-related causes, and this mortality rate is factored into pricing models for construction contracts. Dead slaves get entered in the ledger under equipment disposal and written off against tax obligation. Insurance policies cover slave property against theft, rebellion, and catastrophic loss, but not against normal wear and tear that results from intended use. The premiums reflect statistical analysis of slave mortality rates, escape attempts, and the occasional uprising that requires military intervention. These policies provide compensation for unusual losses, while accepting routine casualties as cost of doing business. The resale market for used slaves operates according to principles familiar to any merchant dealing in depreciating assets. Slaves who've demonstrated reliability command premium prices, while those with injury histories or behavioral problems get discounted accordingly. Age affects value exponentially. Older slaves face rapid depreciation as their remaining useful life decreases and their maintenance costs increase. International trade in human property has created a sophisticated market with established pricing structures, quality standards, and warranty provisions. Egyptian slaves command higher prices in foreign markets due to their reputation for training and compliance. This export demand helps maintain domestic prices while providing economic incentives for continued military expansion to capture additional inventory. The tax implications of slave ownership include depreciation allowances, maintenance deductions, and credits for productive output that contributes to national construction projects. Slave owners can write off medical expenses, housing costs, and food allocation against their tax obligations, making human property ownership attractive from a purely financial perspective. The tax code encourages slave ownership through various incentives that reduce the effective cost of human exploitation. Financial planning for slave-dependent businesses includes provisions for regular replacement of worn-out human assets, seasonal variations in productivity, and market fluctuations in acquisition costs. Successful operations maintain reserve funds for emergency purchases when mortality exceeds actuarial predictions or when construction schedules require additional workforce. These reserves represent sound business practice in industries built on systematic consumption of human lives. The banking system provides loans secured by slave property, with interest rates reflecting the collateral value and depreciation schedules of human assets. These financial instruments allow expansion of slave-dependent operations without requiring full cash investment, creating credit markets that treat people as fungible commodities suitable for leveraging other business activities. Economic analysis of slavery versus free labor consistently favors the slave model for large construction projects. Free workers demand wages that exceed slave maintenance costs, require acceptable working conditions that reduce productivity, and maintain legal rights that interfere with optimal resource allocation. Slaves provide maximum flexibility in workforce management while minimizing labor costs through elimination of worker protections. The multiplier effect of slave labor extends throughout the Egyptian economy, creating jobs for guards, overseers, traders, and support personnel, while generating tax revenue from slave-dependent industries. This economic ecosystem makes abolition of slavery economically disruptive, creating institutional resistance to changes that would reduce profitability of human exploitation. Your individual contribution to these economic calculations amounts to approximately 150 silver pieces in lifetime productivity, minus 12 silver pieces acquisition cost, and roughly 30 silver pieces in maintenance expenses. Net profit from your existence, approximately 100 silver pieces, representing an excellent return on investment that justifies continued expansion of the human property business model. The ledger doesn't record your dreams, your suffering, your relationships, or your humanity. Those items don't have monetary value in the accounting system that determines how long you live and under what conditions you die. You're a line item in a business plan, a data point in a profit calculation, a number in an equation that measures success in silver pieces rather than human dignity. Economic efficiency has reduced your existence to mathematics, and the numbers look very good for everyone except you. The sun finally begins its descent toward the horizon, transforming from a merciless tormentor into a dying ember that promises eventual relief from the day's assault. Your shadow, which disappeared entirely during the noon hours when you became a vertical target for solar punishment, slowly stretches across the sand like a dark promise that this particular marathon of suffering will eventually end, but eventually feels like a geological time frame when measured against the rhythm of limestone hauling and the persistent ache in every joint that's been asked to do more than human engineering intended. The whistle that signals end of work carries across the construction site, with all the musical appeal of a dying bird, but it's the most beautiful sound you've heard in 12 hours. The limestone block that's been your dancing partner in today's waltz of agony finally comes to rest, settling into the sand with a finality that suggests it's as exhausted as you are. The rope harness, which has spent the day redesigning your circulatory system and creating new topographical features across your torso, goes slack with a release of tension that feels like salvation. Around you, the human machinery that powers pharaonic construction begins its shutdown sequence. 20 slaves in your hauling team collapse in various configurations of exhaustion, each body finding whatever position requires the least energy to maintain. While still technically remaining upright, the smart ones stay standing because sitting down would require strength they'll need for walking back to quarters. The desperate ones sprawl immediately, accepting that they'll have to find reserves they don't possess when movement becomes mandatory again. The worksite that buzzed with activity all day begins its transformation into a landscape of abandoned projects and scattered tools. Limestone blocks sit where they were dragged, waiting for tomorrow's continuation of their journey toward architectural immortality. Wooden rollers lie scattered across the sand like the bones of some massive creature that died from exhaustion. Ropes coil in heaps that mark the boundaries of today's achievements in human-powered construction technology. Other work gangs across the construction site are performing their own versions of controlled collapse. Stonecutters set down tools that have become extensions of their hands, leaving behind blocks partially carved and projects half completed. Brickmakers abandon their clay form, walking away from the endless repetition of molding materials that will outlast everyone currently breathing. The entire facility shifts from productive chaos to exhausted stillness, like a machine winding down after a day of operation beyond design specification. The walk back to slave quarters becomes an exercise in applied physics, specifically the physics of moving bodies that have exceeded their operational parameters. Your leg, the one that was injured months ago and never properly healed, announces its displeasure with each step. The rope burns across your chest have evolved into open wounds that weep fluid with every movement. Your hands, locked into the shape of rope gripping for so many hours, refuse to open completely, creating permanent claws that serve as biological reminders of your professional specialization. The evening meal line forms with all the enthusiasm of a funeral procession. Slaves shuffle toward the feeding station with the mechanical precision of people who've learned that survival requires eating regardless of appetite, dignity, or the probability that tonight's offering will be even less appealing than this morning's disappointment. The cook stands behind his pot, with the dead-eyed efficiency of someone who's been ladling punishment into bowls for so long that the distinction between food and torture has become academic. Tonight's culinary masterpiece appears to be yesterday's leftovers mixed with today's creativity, resulting in a substance that challenges the fundamental definition of edible. The consistency suggests that someone dissolved cardboard in water and seasoned it with disappointment. The flavor profile includes notes of despair, hints of sand, and an aftertaste that lingers like regret. But you eat it anyway, because calories are calories, and your body needs fuel for tomorrow's continuation of the limestone ballet. The evening light provides the first relief you've experienced since dawn, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful, if you had energy left for aesthetic appreciation. The Nile glimmers in the distance like liquid gold, reminding you that somewhere beyond this construction site, water exists for purposes other than preventing immediate death from dehydration. Palm trees sway in breezes that feel cool against skin that's been slow cooking all day under Egyptian sun. But beauty becomes irrelevant when survival requires all available mental resources. The sunset might be spectacular, But you're more interested in calculating whether you have enough strength left to make it to sleeping quarters without collapsing. The evening breeze might be refreshing, but you're focused on determining if tonight's wounds need attention that you can't provide. Aesthetic appreciation is a luxury reserved for people whose lives include luxuries. The sleeping quarters welcome you with all the comfort of a tomb designed by someone who's never heard of human anatomy. 20 reed mats arranged with military precision across a floor that's been worn smooth by years of exhausted bodies. The air already carries the accumulated breath of people who've been working past their physical limits, creating an atmosphere that's part human exhalation and part collective exhaustion. You collapse onto your mat, and calling it a mat continues to be optimistic, since it's more like a suggestion of padding between your spine and the stone floor. Your body assumes whatever position causes the least immediate pain, which tonight involves arrangements that would look unnatural to someone who hadn't spent the day being systematically broken down by forced labor. Every muscle aches with the precision of a symphony, each nerve ending contributing its own voice to the chorus of complaint that defines post-work recovery. Around you, other slaves perform their own evening rituals of damage assessment and basic maintenance. Someone quietly tends wounds that have reopened during the day's labor. Another slave stretches muscles that have locked into work position, trying to restore enough flexibility for tomorrow's repetition of the same physical punishment. The smart ones conserve energy by moving as little as possible, understanding that tomorrow will require reserves they're not sure they possess. Sleep comes quickly, not because you're comfortable, but because consciousness has become too expensive to maintain. Your brain, deprived of adequate nutrition and overwhelmed by pain signals, simply shuts down whatever systems aren't essential for basic survival. Dreams, when they come, feature impossible luxuries like soft beds, adequate food, and the revolutionary concept of sleeping until you're actually rested rather than until work resumes. The night air carries sounds that remind you the world continues beyond the boundaries of your suffering. Guards patrol with the lazy confidence of people whose job involves watching other people's misery. Free workers somewhere in the distance laugh at jokes you can't hear, their voices carrying the casual ease of people whose lives include reasons for laughter. Construction equipment creaks in the breeze, settling into positions that suggest even inanimate objects are tired from today's activities. But perhaps the most haunting sound is the absence of sound. The silence of people too exhausted for conversation, too depleted for complaint, too broken for anything beyond the basic biological functions that keep them alive, until morning demands their resurrection for another day of systematic destruction. This is what slavery sounds like. The quiet breathing of people who've learned that energy spent on anything other than survival is energy they can't afford to waste. Tomorrow waits just beyond the horizon, bringing promises of heat, pain, limestone blocks, and rope harnesses. Tonight offers only the temporary reprieve of unconsciousness, the brief mercy of not being awake to experience the full reality of your situation. In a few hours, the wooden rod will crack against the wall. The overseer's voice will cut through pre-dawn darkness, and another day in paradise will begin. But for now, in this moment between today's suffering and tomorrow's continuation of the same suffering, you've achieved the only victory available to slaves. You're still breathing. You've survived another day in conditions designed to kill you. Lasted another rotation of the sun in circumstances that should have broken you completely. Night falls on another day in hell. Morning will rise on another opportunity to discover just how much punishment the human spirit can absorb while still maintaining hope for something better than mere survival. Sleep in slavery doesn't bring the merciful escape that exhaustion promises. Instead, it delivers a parade of psychological torture disguised as dreams, where your unconscious mind processes the day's brutality by replaying it in endless variations that somehow manage to be worse than reality. Tonight's entertainment begins with the familiar nightmare, where you're still hauling limestone, except the block weighs more, the rope burns deeper, and the sun never sets on your suffering. In dream logic, the limestone block becomes a living entity that feeds on human misery, growing heavier with each step as it absorbs the pain of everyone who's ever touched it. The rope harness transforms into a parasite that burrows into your skin, becoming part of your circulatory system until removing it would mean bleeding to death. The construction site stretches to infinite horizons, ensuring that no amount of labor will ever complete the project that justifies your existence. You dream of water, not the metallic tasting disappointment that passes for hydration in waking life, but actual water that tastes like rivers and rain instead of desperation and sand. In the dream, you drink until your body remembers what proper hydration feels like, until your skin stops feeling like parchment stretched over bones, until your mouth produces enough saliva to taste something other than limestone dust. But dream water evaporates the moment you try to swallow it, leaving behind a thirst that's more intense than physical reality. Your unconscious mind, apparently, has developed a sense of humor about survival needs and enjoys taunting you with impossible satisfactions that dissolve the instant you reach for them. Even in sleep, relief remains tantalizingly out of reach. The most cruel dreams involve memories of life before slavery, experiences so distant they feel like stories someone else told you about a person who shared your name. You dream of choosing what to eat, sleeping until you wake naturally, and walking wherever you want without ropes, harnesses, or overseers with whips. These memories feel simultaneously precious and painful, reminders of humanity you've almost forgotten how to access. In one recurring dream, you're sitting at a table laden with food that hasn't been calculated to provide minimum nutrition at maximum economy, bread with actual crust, meat that comes from identifiable animals, fruits that taste like sweetness instead of storage. You reach for the food, but your hands have become tools shaped for gripping rope and hauling stone, incapable of the delicate motions required for civilized eating. To dream about your family visits regularly, bringing psychological punishment that makes physical torture seem merciful. By comparison, you see faces you've tried to forget, because remembering them makes survival more difficult. Voices call your original name, not the designation you've been assigned for work purposes, but the name that connected you to people who valued your existence for reasons beyond limestone transportation. In the family dream, they're searching for you, asking questions about your location and welfare that no one can answer because slaves disappear into the construction industry like stones dropped into deep water. You try to call out, to let them know where you are and what's happened to you, but your voice produces only the sounds that overseers want to hear: compliance, submission, and the wordless noises of human machinery performing its designated function. Sometimes you dream of escape, elaborate fantasies where you slip away from the construction site and journey back to whatever life you remember having before Egyptian hospitality transformed you into a biological tool. These dreams feature impossible scenarios where guards don't notice your absence, overseers don't pursue missing property, and the desert doesn't kill runaway slaves with the efficiency of a well-designed execution method. The escape dreams always end the same way. You discover that the person you're trying to return to no longer exists. Slavery has changed you so fundamentally that the life you remember wouldn't fit anymore even if you could reach it. The psychological transformation required for survival has altered your personality, your priorities, and your capacity for the kind of hope that normal life requires. You dream of rebellion, scenarios where the slaves coordinate resistance against their overseers and guards. In these fantasies, the years of accumulated rage finally find expression in organized violence that turns the power structure upside down. Whips change hands, roles reverse, and the people who've been systematically tortured get opportunities to demonstrate their own understanding of motivational techniques. But even in dreams, rebellion fails. The mathematical reality of armed guards versus unarmed slaves, the logistics of coordinating action among people too exhausted for complex planning, and the inevitable punishment that follows any attempt at resistance. Your unconscious mind understands the practical impossibilities that make rebellion a suicide mission disguised as revolution. The most disturbing dreams involve accepting your situation, finding contentment in slavery, and losing the psychological resistance that makes you still recognizably human. In these nightmares, you wake up grateful for your rope harness, eager to haul limestone, and genuinely happy to serve pharaonic construction projects. The horror isn't the continued suffering, It's the possibility of becoming someone who no longer suffers because they no longer remember that suffering is wrong. Sometimes you dream of the limestone block achieving consciousness and offering philosophical commentary on the construction process. It explains that pyramids require sacrifice, that immortality demands mortality, and that your suffering serves purposes greater than individual comfort. Dream limestone speaks with the voice of authority, making arguments that sound reasonable until you wake up and remember that rocks don't actually justify human exploitation. The dreams about your own death arrive with disappointing frequency, featuring scenarios where your body finally gives up the struggle to continue functioning under impossible conditions. These aren't nightmares in the traditional sense. Sometimes death dreams feel more like relief than terror. The horror comes from waking up disappointed that the dream wasn't real, that you're still alive and facing another day of systematic destruction. You dream of the pharaoh, though you've never seen him, and probably never will. In dream logic, he appears as a figure simultaneously divine and human, explaining that your suffering serves eternal purposes that justify temporary discomfort. Dream Pharaoh speaks with genuine sympathy about the necessity of your sacrifice, making slavery sound like a religious calling rather than economic exploitation. But the cruelest dreams are the ones where life gets better, where overseers develop sympathy, where working conditions improve, where slaves receive treatment that acknowledges their humanity. You wake from these dreams to the crack of wooden rods against walls, and the familiar voice announcing another day of discovering new limits to human endurance. Dawn approaches with the inevitability of death and the promise of renewed suffering. The dreams fade like smoke, leaving behind only the memory of impossible hopes and the psychological residue of processing another day's brutality. Your unconscious mind, having completed its nightly routine of reviewing trauma and generating false comfort, prepares to hand consciousness back to a body that must somehow function despite everything that's been done to it. The wooden rod will crack against the wall soon. The overseer's voice will cut through pre-dawn darkness. Another day in paradise will begin, featuring limestone blocks, rope harnesses, and the continuation of discovering exactly how much punishment human beings can absorb, while still maintaining enough hope to get up and do it again. Dreams die before dawn, killed by the reality of morning whistles and the persistent delusion that tomorrow might somehow be different from today. The word spreads through the slave quarters like whispered fire, passed from reed mat to reed mat, in the precious minutes between collapse and unconsciousness, when guards assume everyone is too exhausted for conversation. Someone knows someone who heard from someone else that there's going to be a rebellion. Finally, after months of systematic torture, the slaves are going to coordinate resistance against their oppressors and reclaim their humanity through organized violence. The fantasy has everything that desperate people need to believe: detailed planning, reliable intelligence about guard movements, weapons hidden in strategic locations, and coordination with sympathetic free workers who've grown disgusted with the brutality they witness daily. Most importantly, the rebellion has leadership, slaves who've survived long enough to understand the system's weaknesses and developed the charisma necessary to unite hundreds of people in common cause. You want to believe it so desperately that you ignore the logical problems with coordinating resistance among people who barely have energy left for basic survival. The rebellion requires communication networks among workers who see each other only during shift changes, weapons procurement by people who can't access anything sharper than rope, and strategic planning by minds that have been systematically starved of the nutrition necessary for complex thought. But hope operates according to different mathematics than logic, and the possibility of rebellion provides psychological relief that makes another day of limestone hauling seem endurable. For the first time in months, you fall asleep thinking about something other than mere survival. The dream of fighting back, of seeing overseers experience the terror they've been inflicting, of participating in justice instead of just enduring injustice. These fantasies provide emotional fuel that makes consciousness less unbearable. The rebellion is scheduled for tomorrow night, when the moon will be dark enough to provide cover for coordinated action. The plan involves simultaneous attacks on guard posts, seizure of weapons from armories, and occupation of strategic positions that control access to the construction site. Once the immediate tactical objectives are secured, the rebellion will spread to other slave facilities throughout the region, creating a popular uprising that Egyptian authorities can't suppress through normal military response. You lie on your reed mat, calculating the probability of success and finding the numbers oddly comforting, even though they don't add up to anything approaching realistic hope. 200 slaves against 50 guards, armed with professional weapons and military training. Coordination among people who've never planned anything more complex than hiding injuries from supervisors. Strategic objectives that require knowledge of facility layouts that slaves aren't allowed to access. But the mathematical impossibilities become less important than the psychological necessity of believing that resistance is possible. The rebellion represents proof that the essential human spirit survives even systematic attempts to destroy it. That people can choose death with dignity over life without it. That collaboration in your own destruction isn't the only available option. The next day's work proceeds with undercurrents of anticipation that make the limestone blocks seem lighter and the rope harnesses less punishing. Slaves exchange meaningful glances that supposedly confirm continued commitment to the evening's action. Conversations develop double meanings where routine work coordination contains coded references to rebellion logistics. Even the overseers seem to sense that something has changed in the psychological atmosphere, though they interpret the subtle behavioral shifts as improved morale rather than preparation for violence. Evening arrives with the usual exhaustion, but tonight the collapse onto sleeping mats carries additional weight of anticipation. This is the night when months of accumulated rage finally find expression through organized action. This is when human dignity reasserts itself against systematic attempts to eliminate it. This is when the people who've been treated like construction equipment remind everyone that machines don't rebel, but humans do. The signal never comes. Whatever coordination was supposed to trigger simultaneous action across the facility fails to materialize. Minutes pass, then hours, and gradually the waiting slaves realize that the rebellion exists only in whispered conversations and desperate hopes. No weapons appear, no leaders emerge from the darkness. No coordinated assault begins the liberation that everyone needed to believe was possible. The reaction isn't anger or disappointment. Emotions that require energy reserves nobody possesses. Instead, there's a collective deflation, a psychological settling that acknowledges the return to reality after a brief vacation in the land of impossible hope. The rebellion dies not with violence or dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet recognition that survival requires accepting limitations rather than fighting them. Some slaves blame informants for betraying the rebellion to guards who prevented it through increased security measures. Others conclude that the entire plan was fantasy from the beginning. Stories that desperate people tell themselves to maintain sanity under conditions designed to destroy rational thought. A few decide that the rebellion was real, but poorly timed, requiring additional planning and better coordination for future success. The truth is probably simpler and more depressing. There never was a rebellion, because people who've been systematically broken don't spontaneously reassemble themselves into fighting units. The psychological and physical damage that slavery inflicts makes coordinated resistance nearly impossible, not because slaves lack courage, but because they lack the resources necessary for complex planning and sustained action. You realize that the rebellion served its real purpose without ever happening. For a few days, the possibility of resistance provided psychological relief that made continued survival tolerable. The fantasy of fighting back allowed slaves to maintain some connection to their humanity, even if they could never actually express that humanity through organized action. Hope, even false hope, turns out to be a survival tool. The guards, who probably knew about the rebellion rumors from the beginning, allow the entire episode to pass without punishment or increased security measures. They understand that letting slaves believe in impossible resistance is more effective than preventing them from discussing it. False hope is another management tool, providing just enough psychological relief to prevent genuine despair while ensuring that actual rebellion remains impossible. The morning after the rebellion that never came brings the familiar crack of wooden rods against walls, and the overseer's voice announcing another day of discovering new limits to human endurance. The limestone blocks wait with their usual patient malevolence. The rope harnesses hang ready for another day of redesigning your circulatory system, and the construction site beckons with promises of heat, pain, and systematic destruction of human dignity. But something has changed in the psychological landscape of slavery. The failed rebellion serves as proof that resistance is impossible. That hope is a luxury that survival can't afford, and that accepting your situation is more practical than fighting it. The psychological damage extends beyond physical torture to include the destruction of the essential human belief that circumstances can be changed through action. This is how slavery maintains itself over time, not just through whips and chains, but through the systematic destruction of the psychological foundation that makes resistance possible. The rebellion that never comes teaches a lesson more effective than any punishment. That hope itself is the enemy of survival. That dreaming of freedom makes accepting bondage more difficult. The morning work routine resumes with no acknowledgement of yesterday's failed uprising. Limestone blocks need moving. Pyramid construction demands progress. And the Pharaoh's Immortality Project continues its relentless consumption of human lives. The rebellion becomes another dream that died before dawn. Another hope that couldn't survive contact with reality. But late at night, when exhaustion makes truth easier to face, you understand that the real rebellion isn't coordinated violence or dramatic uprising. It's the simple act of maintaining humanity under conditions designed to eliminate it, of preserving dignity when everything around you denies its existence, of continuing to hope even when hope proves consistently futile. Love in slavery doesn't triumph over oppression. It just proves that humanity persists in conditions designed to eliminate it completely.